Alright, so usually I don't do this, but I want to start out this video with a little bit of a story, because Styanax is very close to my heart. See, almost 4 years ago when his original version released, I had just started this channel right here. I think at that point I only had 3 videos out and barely any views. However, with his release, I thought, why don't I make a day 1 guide? And this one absolutely blew up, getting over 40,000 views in the first 24 hours, therefore jump-starting the growth of this channel. So, now that Styanax has gotten his beautiful Prime glow-up, let's repay the favor and give him a couple of very strong updated 2026 builds. Big shoutouts to our lovely channel members for helping me keep the lights on, and now let's jump right into it. But first of all, it's been almost 4 years, let's talk about Styanax's ability so that we're all on the same page. Starting out, his passive is very simple and straightforward. You get a weapon crit chance bonus that scales with your current shields. For every 40 shield points that you have, you will get 1% additional crit chance, and this one basically adjusts live with your current shield count. It doesn't go for your maximum shields or whatever, it just looks at how many shields you currently have. So at full shields, you're gonna get a lot of crit chance, at low shields, you're gonna get less. This weapon crit chance bonus works just like a crit chance mod, it stacks additively with point strike, so if you have a lot of shields, just think that you have basically 2 times point strike on your weapon. That's all there is to it. Only little addition that I should mention here is, if you use a spear gun type weapon, like for example his signature, the Aphentis, then on those types of weapons, the crit chance bonus is doubled. Ability number 1 goes by the name Axios Javelin, and this one is a little bit of a weird grouping ability. See, what happens here is, when you cast the ability, you're gonna throw out 1 javelin. If this javelin manages to hit an enemy, it will impale the enemy and create a vortex that will suck in nearby enemies. However, by default, the grouping really only works if you manage to impale an enemy to a surface. If your spear just lands on the wall, it's not gonna do anything. To be 100% fair though, the Javelin does have a little bit of a homing capacity, so if you barely aim past an enemy it will still hit them, but you still have to keep in mind the enemy needs to be impaled, otherwise the grouping is not gonna happen. One weird quirk about this skill is that the damage that it deals when it hits an enemy, that is scaling with universal weapon bonuses, like Arcane Arachne, like Grendel's Nourish, and so on. It's not worth building for because, the damage is just not good enough for that anyway, but I wanted to mention it still as a little neat-to-know fact. Now, Axios Javelin has an augment called Axios Javelineers, and this is... I feel this is a really stupid augment. I think this should be somewhat part of the skill itself. Let me explain. What this one does is, whenever you throw the spear, you create 2 clones, which are also throwing a spear. So it basically means you throw 3 spears. The main selling point though is that with Axios Javelineers, no matter if you impale an enemy or not, it's gonna create the vortex anyway. And it's gonna create multiple vortexes for all 3 spears then. So yeah, that's basically what I'm saying, right? I think this should be part of the base spear already. No matter if you hit an enemy or not, it should create the vortex, because otherwise it's just, I don't want to allocate 1 mod slot just to this 1 augment to make my first ability consistent. That's what I'm trying to say. If you wanted to, you could still use it, it gives you this much needed consistency, but it still hurts that you need to give up 1 mod slot just to fix the problems of the first ability. Ability number 2, Tharros Strike, the, in my opinion, best armor stripping ability in the game. When you cast this ability, you're gonna shoot out a bunch of shields in a cone in front of you. Enemies hit by these shields will be pushed back a little bit, and they will permanently lose a portion of their armor as well as shields. This scales with ability strength, which means that you can permanently reduce the defenses of literally any enemy with just 1 cast of this skill. The cool thing with Tharros Strike, in contrast to some other armor stripping abilities like for example Necros' Terrify, is that Tharros Strike even works on most elite enemies, like for example Acolytes. Elite enemies is something that Necros' Terrify struggles quite a bit. However, what really sets Tharros Strike apart of literally any other armor stripping ability in the game would be the augment Tharros Lethality. This one is relatively new, I think it was introduced in last autumn or something, and what this one does is, against enemies hit by Tharros Strike, you will get more critical damage, doubled for spear guns. This 100% extra crit damage scales with ability strength. So if you have, let's say, 300% ability strength, that means your weapons are gonna get 300% more crit damage against the enemies that you just armor stripped. Like, with this augment, you turn any elite enemy into a wet tissue box. Like, nothing is gonna survive this. It is crazy. And yes, Tharros Strike is Styanax's Helminth ability, so you can put this on any other Warframe, combined with the Tharros Lethality Augment. I've made a video back when it released, and it is crazy. It is so good. Skill number 3, Rally Point. This one is also an absolute banger. When you cast it, it increases your personal threat level, meaning enemies will focus on you. However, it also grants 2 very powerful buffs to yourself and allies in range. And those are that, first of all, you have a constant energy regeneration that scales with ability strength and therefore can be very strong. On many builds, this is the only energy economy tool that you ever need. And in addition to that, it also makes it that for every kill or kill assist, you restore a portion of your shields. This is very good for survivability because Styanax has already a great shield pool, plus it also supports your passive ability, which gives you higher crit chances for higher shields. What's even better is that even if your shields completely break, this shield refill will still trigger, so it also allows you to easily shield gate with Styanax even in very high levels. If you ask me, Rally Point, one ability that you should have always on Styanax, no exceptions. And last but not least, we have his ultimate ability, Final Stand. And this one is a bit interesting because it is one of the quote-unquote stereotypical ultimate bada-boom abilities. However, it still came from an era where the ultimate bada-boom abilities were not as useful as they are today. Let me explain. What happens when you cast the ability is, you're gonna jump in the air and have a ton of your clones next to you, which all will start throwing a whole barrage of spears at the enemy. On impact, the spears will either deal direct slash damage against the foes, or if you don't directly hit, they will also have a healthy AoE, so it's not really necessary to aim this. The weird quirk here is that the direct hit damage is considered slash with a 50% slash status chance, while the AoE portion is considered blast damage, but still has slash status effects. Those though are guaranteed. So how does that make sense that the direct hit deals slash damage but only has a 50% status chance, but the AoE deals blast damage with 100% slash damage? We don't question this. Just keep in mind, you throw spears, they make big bada boom lot of slashes, bleed damage. Now, while a barrage of these javelins definitely deals decent damage, it is also not as impressive as it looks against armored steel path enemies. However though, there is a little hidden interaction that will make them much stronger. Because similar to the javelin throw from your first ability, also here, the damage of your javelins scales with universal weapon bonuses. That means if you use Arcane Arachne, that's a multiplicative plus 150% more damage. If you use Nourish, that is also multiplicative viral damage. With these interactions, the mediocre default damage isn't really a problem anymore because you can still buff it quite a bit and it becomes perfectly viable in Steel Path 2. But also here, we're not done yet because Final Stand has an augment called Intrepid Stand. This one will make it that for every hit that you score with your spears, you and your allies in affinity range, so 50 meters by default, will get a bit of overguard. Given how many of these javelins you throw, this overguard goes up quite a bit. On the one hand, that means you have a good survivability tool in this and you don't need to take that much into shields then, but on the other hand, it also means you can, for example, combine this with Arcane Truculence. Arcane Truculence viral primes all the enemies in a big AoE with 10 viral procs whenever you hit intervals of 3000 overguard. Given that Intrepid Stand raises your overguards in small increments, that means it is tailor-made to trigger Arcane Truculence over and over again. This way, all your foes are going to be viral primed, they're going to take 4 times the damage, and that makes your spears even stronger. I don't say you have to use this, there are definitely other arcane options, but I just wanted to mention it because I think it is a very good synergy. And as always, if you could leave a quick like for the video, that would be really helpful with the YouTube algorithm, so thank you so much for your support. Let's though get into the builds, and as per usual, the first thing we talk about is the Helminth options that we have at our disposal. And just like with many other Warframes, also for Styanax, you're basically free to go whatever you like. However, there are a couple of specific skills that I want to talk about here, and also one unfortunate issue that we have here. So let's get into that. First of all, as with like all my recent Warframe builds, yes, we can go for Roar. Roar is universal faction damage bonus, that means it double dips on damage over time effects and it makes number bigger. It's good for weapon platform builds, and it's also good if you want to build for your 4th ability because it inflicts a ton of slashes, and with Roar, the slashes double dip so the damage over time is better. Not much more to say here. However, the next skill on our list would be Nourish, and with Nourish we have a bit of an issue that we usually don't see on other Warframes. So let me explain. First of all, there are multiple reasons why Nourish is so good on Styanax. The first one of which would be the energy multiplier. Remember, with our 3rd ability, we have constant energy regeneration. This regeneration, though, is not that crazy high. For a spam-heavy build, it's not going to be able to sustain us. With Nourish, however, though, we slap that fat multiplier on the energy regeneration, and that will boost our energy income so hard that we literally do not need anything else. Like the 3rd ability is just going to keep us full all the time. In addition to that, we of course have the viral priming, the viral explosion that happens whenever you take a hit, as well as the additional weapon damage. And this is twofold, actually. First of all, on the Gunrunner build, Nourish gives viral to your weapons. However, remember how we mentioned that the damage from our 4th ability is actually scaling with universal weapon bonuses? Well, turns out that Nourish is a universal weapon viral bonus, meaning our 4th ability gets damage boosted by Nourish as well, even though it's not even a weapon. And while this is great, it also leads to the big problem that I mentioned. What I'm talking about is, if you want to use Nourish on a Gunrunner build, then, as you see right here, you have to subsume it over your 4th ability, right? Your 4th ability, you don't need that on a Gunrunner build, and all the other ones, you kinda wanna have them. However though, if you wanted to use Nourish on a build that is meant to use your 4th ability, you would have to put it over your 2. And that is the big issue, because in Warframe you cannot subsume the same ability onto 2 different slots on 2 different loadouts. It's either every loadout has it over the 4, or every loadout has it over the 2. And that means if you want to use Nourish on a Gunrunner build as well as an Ultimate build, then you gotta have 2 different Styanaxes. That is very, very unfortunate, and also the reason why on my Ultimate build I used Roar as a substitute instead of Nourish, because I just couldn't make it work on the same Warframe. And lastly, the 3rd ability that I want to talk about, and we also have a build with that later, would be Pyrotechnics from Temple. This one has a bit of a weird interaction with enemies that are ragdolled. Because against enemies that are ragdolled, Pyrotechnics kind of sort of detects every single body part of the enemy as a target, and that will give you crazy overpowered amounts of heat procs and just deal massive damage. The reason why that is good is because, our 1st ability, our grouping, that ragdolls the enemies. And we're going to talk about that later in the build section as well. But whoever says Helminth also needs to say Archon Shards, so let's quickly talk about that as well. What I personally did is I went for 2 blue ones into more maximum energy. The reason I did this is because I have one build where I don't go for a flow mod and I fully rely on just having that energy recharge keeping me sustained. The thing is that the base energy without flow mod is very darn low though, and these 2 ones just help with that specific setup. If you want to go for flow in your build, then of course you don't need these 2. As for the other ones, really the only thing that I had in mind was going for more ability strength. I don't feel that Styanax necessarily needs more casting speed, his abilities are fine as is. And also, he cannot inflict toxin with abilities, he cannot inflict blast with abilities, no radiation, no electricity. Like, you can use the elemental shards right here if you have a specific subsume that would open any of these opportunities up here. But for today, I just don't have that. So I just went for more strength for make number more big. And that's really all there is to say here. Let's though get into the modding right now. And the first build I want to speak about today is a standard Gunrunner build that is pretty darn strong though, and much fun because, Styanax is very, very beautiful. Let's take a look at it. As a Helminth subsume, as I previously mentioned, we go Nourish and we put it over our 4th. Nourish is then going to help with the energy income, boosting the 10 energy per second that we get here to something like, what do we have here, 30 energy per second, and that means we don't need to have any other energy economy tool whatsoever. Also, this is the build, you can see right here, where we don't use a flow mod, which is the reason that I had the aforementioned 2 blue shards to, get us to 365. That is enough with all the energy regen that we're gonna have. In the aura, I went for growing power because it gives us more ability strength, and on a gunrunner build, we're gonna trigger this all the time anyway. However, if you have other preferences, you go for whatever you like. Same goes for the Excellent slot, where I went for Prime Sure-Footed. To stay alive, all we really do here is go for adaptation to give us a layer of damage reduction, and then combine that with primed redirection for more shields. Given that Styanax has very high base shields, we're almost at 3000 just with that. And given the fact that our third ability will give us, at this point, over 170 shields back per kill or assist, that means it's not really all that difficult to sustain our shields. If you wanted to, however, you could supercharge the whole thing with Arcane Aegis, which will give you constant shield recharge if you feel like you need that. Or if you want to supercharge the amount of shields that you have, you could go for Arcane Expertise as well, which will then, you see right here, it's going to be a little bit ridiculous. One thing I gotta mention with the shields though would be Styanax's passive. Remember, you increase your weapon crit chance by 1% for every 40 shield points that you have. So that means if we have more shields, we get more crit buff from our passive. I gotta be 100% real though, I personally feel that going for more ability strength instead of Arcane Expertise here, I think that is a better call. I just prefer it that way, because the crit chance buff from our passive, it is not that crazy impressive that it would justify investing into like 5,000 shields or something. Of course, comes down to personal preference, but I'm just saying I feel like 2,800 is more than enough. The rest of the build then focuses primarily on ability strength, as you can also see right here, because strength basically gives us everything we need. More energy, more damage from Nourish, more shield refill, more energy refill from our 3. We combine that with Tharros lethality, which gives us more crit damage against enemies armor stripped by Tharros strike. And also here, more strength gives us more crit damage. You get the point, right? It's a strength build with a little bit of duration and range sprinkled on top for convenience. One of the reasons though why I think we don't need to focus on getting that much crit chance from the passive is that we get a lot of crit chance from Arcane Hotshot right here. This one gives us 300% weapon crit chance on top of whatever the passive gives us, so that is pretty darn strong. Only kicker here is, in order to trigger Arcane Hotshot, you need to inflict heat status with abilities. So how do we do that, right? We don't have any abilities that trigger heat status. Well, for that, we take a look at our companion, because who we have here is Diriga. I'm sure some of you already know this interaction, but just in case you don't, let me quickly explain. If you use our coil on Diriga, then Diriga will zap nearby enemies. This is considered a ability. And if we combine that with Manifold Bond, then this ability is also going to inflict all the status effects that are modded on Diriga's weapon. So if we have something like, for example, the Volcax right here, which does heat, then the zaps from Diriga are considered an ability inflicting heat, and that will then, even though we're not doing that ourselves, that will then go and trigger our Arcane Hotshot. It's actually very easy to sustain this all the time with Diriga. However though, if you feel like, playing Styanax as a quote-unquote boring old gunrunner is not for you, and you want to lean fully into his Spartan nature, then let's talk about the ultimate build that focuses on dealing a lot of damage with our nice little spear throw right here. Just as I previously mentioned in the Helminth section, one disclaimer, I use Roar here over my second ability. It is also perfectly viable, and maybe even better, to go for Nourish instead of Roar here, but because I have Nourish over my fourth ability on the previous build, that means I can't have Nourish on a different slot on this build, right? So for the sake of today, we're just gonna assume that we have Nourish instead of Roar here. Main difference between Nourish and Roar on this build is, with Roar, you strengthen the damage over time from the slashes that you inflict. With Nourish, you're just gonna inflict more upfront damage, which I think would probably be my favorite here. Also here, Aura as well as Excellence are up to personal preference. However, I would say going for preparation to have maxed out energy at the start of the mission, that is really, really good on this because it needs a little bit of setup, right? You need to cast your third ability to get the energy income rolling. You gotta cast your Roar as a damage buff. And then, your final stand is also pretty expensive to cast. Going with preparation definitely can't hurt. To ensure that we have a lot of damage, we go for a bunch of strength with Blind Rage and Transient Fortitude and Umbral Intensify. However, we reduce that a little bit by overextended because on this build right here, we want to group up enemies quite a bit with our first skill, and that likes to have a bit more range. If you feel like going for just stretch here would be fine, you can do that, right? It reduces the pull range from your first ability a little bit, but therefore you gain more strength and therefore more damage. Now, for the survivability, we actually don't go into shields, we just, take whatever we have, because we use the augment Intrepid Stand. This one gives us overguard whenever we hit enemies with our final stand. And that overguard is pretty healthy and can keep us alive decently, so no need for shields or adaptation or anything. One thing though that is very, very important with this ultimate build would be Arcane Arachne. Remember how I said that our fourth ability scales with universal weapon damage bonuses? Well, Arcane Arachne is one that is pretty easy to trigger. Just wall latch once every 30 seconds, and then you get 150% multiplicative damage to your 4. This one is basically mandatory, otherwise the 4 is gonna struggle a little bit with damage output. And in order to supercharge our damage output even further, I went for Arcane Concentration. This one gives us a massive 60% ability duration boost, and that is actually pretty cool. Because for our fourth ability, the number of javelins that we throw, currently at 38, that scales with ability duration. The more duration you have, the longer you stay in the air, the more spears you throw, the more overall damage you deal. And given the fact that before executing your 4, you're technically always doing something else, like for example grouping up the enemies with your first, that means Arcane Concentration isn't even difficult to trigger, right? In practice, you throw your first to group up the enemies in one blob. That will then activate Arcane Concentration, and then you can use your fourth under the buff of Arcane Concentration to attack the enemies that are blobbed up. And then lastly, I don't necessarily want to call this a separate build because it's mainly a sub-variant of the ultimate build that we had earlier, but this one right here is the Pyrotechnics build that I teased in the Helminth section. What we do here is, instead of nuking away enemies with our 4, we use Pyrotechnics from Temple. The reason Pyrotechnics is so strong on Styanax is that the first ability when we group up the enemies, that ragdolls them. And Pyrotechnics detects every limb of the enemy if they're ragdolled as separate target, which leads to crazy amounts of heat procs and therefore just absolutely ludicrous damage. If you ask me, Pyrotechnics is actually much stronger than Styanax's own ultimate, which is a little bit sad at the same time. Also, for this sub-variant of the ultimate build, Aura as well as Exilus, you do you, but what is important that we still have Arcane Arachne on, because just like Styanax's ult, also Pyrotechnics scales with universal weapon bonuses. That is very nice. However though, given that we don't have the augment that gives us overguard anymore, because we got rid of Final Stand, that means our survivability has to come from shields again, which is the reason why I went for Arcane Expertise. The reason we don't go for Prime Redirection like we did earlier is that we need that extra mod slot for Archon Vitality, because Archon Vitality doubles our heat procs inflicted by abilities, meaning it doubles the damage output of Pyrotechnics. Would be pretty stupid if we don't use this. Other than that though, the build is relatively the same and works pretty much the same way as the normal ultimate build as well. If you like Styanax, you should definitely try out the Pyrotechnics because it is absolutely mental, it is so much fun to play. And now also check out my full guide on the brand new Warframes, Sirius and Orion right here. Another massive shout out to Niels V, Demon Lord Zell, Demon Emperor, Emperor Prime, Nost Linux Gaming, Turtlepeer, Ondokaneo2, Skylar Bowser, Mihaki, Socrates the Almighty Rat, Leo Morizaki, Shadow Lockhart, Hound Takas, Blade Crusader, Boomia1, Mr. Games Plays, Zave, Alwindai, Azengen, Quax, Henrik5984, Blue Eagle 98, Hearthwield, Everin 8802, Gabriel Tevez, Jaco Ivan Gonzalez, Candy Fox 19, Argentat, GE Schnoz, and all other generous channel members for your continuous support. We see each other hopefully in the next one, and until then, have a nice weekend.